Thanks very much, Tim. I appreciate the invitation here, and it's a privilege to be in West Branch again. 3 years ago, I spent 15 months in residence here at the Hoover Library, and I was here practically every day, including the day before Christmas, when the only two people in the library were the director, Tim Walsh, who was manning the reference desk, and me, and the rest of the staff was on vacation. And I noted to Tim that if I weren't here today in the reading room, you could shut up the place and go home. And he said, yes, Glenn, but you're doing the work of the Lord. And I came to here, and I didn't know a soul in West Branch, and I was here for 15 months, a sabbatical plus a summer, and I'd spent 3 summers earlier, and I was never lonely for a single day. Part of the secret was that I rented an apartment above Herb and Lou's bar and pizza place. It was a real privilege to go downstairs because people would, probably the only place in the country this would happen, would buy me drinks for talking about Herbert Hoover. And both could go on all night.
And carry you upstairs.
Carry me upstairs. As other people have said, I found this the most user-friendly presidential library I've ever worked in. And the staff was very friendly and very efficient, and I made lifelong friends. I want to mention Tim Walsh and Matt Schaefer in particular. I will miss Tim very much, but it is a real pleasure to be here again. Unlike two previous speakers, I'm not looking back on a biography, but looking forward on one that's in progress, and it's going to be less about me than it is going to be about Herbert Hoover. When the country sank into the Great Recession in 2008, memories of the Great Depression were resurrected, and the name Herbert Hoover was dusted off for a new round of scolding. Once known as the great engineer, then the great humanitarian, the man who had failed at nothing before becoming president, watched his reputation disintegrate during the economic catastrophe. He became the object of partisan blame and historical chastisement. In 2008, the media glibly described Hoover as a miserly misanthrope, a man who would rather feed cows than people, hard-headed and hard-hearted, frozen in indifference. He was repeatedly reprimanded as a champion of laissez-faire, a term in philosophy he had specifically rejected as early as 1922 when he published his philosophical treatise, American Individualism. From the right, popular writer Amity Shlaes, author of The Forgotten Man, glibly impaled Hoover from the libertarian end of the spectrum. According to Shlaes, Hoover was a co-conspirator with Franklin D. Roosevelt. The duo prolonged the Great Depression by meddling with the economy. The real hero in her mind was Hoover's first Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, who advised the president to leave well enough alone. The libertarian economic argument aside, in modern times it is politically impossible to ignore an economic downturn. Writing history backwards produces distortions because it is often described the way it should have happened rather than the way it actually happened. What people should have done instead of what they actually did do. Too many books about Herbert Hoover have been about what he did not do, not about what he did. Historians cannot write history precisely as it happened because it is too long, too complicated, and not sufficiently self-explanatory. During his own presidency, Hoover's reputation plummeted to the point that Will Rogers quipped that a man bit into an apple, found a worm, and exclaimed, "Damn Hoover." During the 1932 campaign, Franklin D. Roosevelt branded Hoover a do-nothing president. FDR continued to run against Hoover, employing similar simplicities in 1936, 1940, and 1944, when his real opponents were Alf Landon, Wendell Willkie, and Thomas Dewey. Virtually every Democratic candidate since FDR has equated Hoover with hard times. Presidential polls of historians as late as 2008 rank him as among the worst presidents. That was about me. Never confuse yourself with your subject. During the 2008 campaign, a Democratic senator condemned Hoover as a laissez-faire president, apathetic to the plight of the jobless. Even Republican candidate John McCain in 2008 took up the cudgel against Hoover. In the second presidential debate, in an effort to portray his Democratic opponent, Barack Obama, as a big spender who would raise taxes, McCain stated that the last president to raise taxes in hard times had been Herbert Hoover, forgetting that Franklin Roosevelt had raised taxes in 1935 and again in 1936, and that George H.W. Bush did so during the recession of the early 1990s after promising, "Read my lips, no new taxes." No one at the debate, neither McCain's opponent nor anyone in the print or television media, detected the gaffe. In fact, they still had not caught it by the third debate, so McCain repeated it. What is the truth about Herbert Hoover? Where does he fit in presidential historiography? And why does he remain enmeshed in a maze of myths? Is he a reactionary, a mainstream conservative, a progressive, or does he belong on the cutting edge of the New Deal? Dismissing Hoover as Ebenezer Scrooge, despite the fact that he succeeded Calvin Coolidge, is premised partly on the myth that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. It was World War II, or more specifically, consumer spending after World War II, that permanently ended the Depression. Government spending alone to create jobs can never end a depression or a major recession in a capitalist economy, because the jobs end when the project ends or when the appropriation expires. Neither are tax cuts an infallible remedy, because people often hoard them rather than spend them. A better idea would be to issue every adult American a debit card with an expiration date. Spend it or lose it. Hoover correctly believed that the key to ending the Depression was not creating new, temporary government jobs, but restoring old, permanent jobs. To set the record straight, unemployment was higher in all but one of the first 8 years of the New Deal than it was during the 4 years of the Hoover administration. It is certainly plausible to argue that the Depression worsened in spite of Hoover's actions, not because of them, and that it is likely to have worsened between 1929 and 1933 with any other president in office, including Hoover's successor. Hoover's task was not enviable. In a victorious war, everyone fights together. In a depression, everyone fights each other. In a depression, in a victorious war, people sacrifice and accept artificial rationing, but complain and refuse to accept national economic shortages during a depression. Hard times often bring out the worst in people. blame becomes the national pastime. Those who have partisan or personal antipathy towards Hoover have stereotyped him as the primary victim of the Depression, the primary villain of the Depression, a figure shrouded by the shadows of history, as evil and menacing as the Boston Strangler. In fact, had the Boston Strangler run against Hoover for president in 1932, it might have been a dead heat. I doubt seriously, though, that the Boston Strangler could have got the Democratic nomination. People who have voted that year believe things could not possibly get worse. People who voted in Germany that year felt the same way. Upon retiring, Hoover marched into the Death Valley of historians, surrounded by writers armed with pens and typewriters, occupying canyons on all sides. Unfortunately, some did not also arm themselves with facts. An archivist from the Hoover Presidential Library once dined with the eminent economist, the late John Kenneth Galbraith, who had written about Hoover's role in the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. Galbraith asked the Hoover archivist what he did for a living. When he replied that he worked at the Hoover Library, Galbraith, who was unaware that such a library existed, exclaimed, "A library for Herbert Hoover? How sad." Hoover's reputation had toppled into a black hole into which things go in and never come out. He was either too liberal or too conservative, too bland, too smug, a poor party leader, and a stubborn partisan. He was all bad things to all people. Hoover was done for being unimaginative as well. When people think Depression, they think Hoover. They might as well be listed in Roget's thesaurus as synonyms. Understanding Hoover's place in history requires historical context. In the 1910s and 1920s, Hoover was idolized by many progressives. As president, he was the most active chief executive during hard times up to that time. The first to pit the government against the economic cycle. Many of his programs, such as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, were vital to the New Deal. An argument can be made that he was one of the more liberal Republican presidents of the 20th century and the most innovative. He was the best idea man in his own administration. He wrote his own speeches because he believed parroting ghostwriters was intellectually dishonest. He was the last president to do so. Yet, Hoover was not Roosevelt writ small. He believed in personal responsibility, self-help, balanced budgets, decentralization, and decentralization of powers, separation of powers. He deplored use of public jobs as political patronage, one of his chief criticisms of the New Deal. He believed in states' rights, and in the late 1930s was a non-interventionist. In all of this, he remained true to his Quaker roots. The fact that Hoover was a Quaker is more important than that John Kennedy was a Catholic. Kennedy was more an outward, symbolic Christian. Quakers do not necessarily find God between the walls of churches, but rather within their inner light, stripping religion of its artifacts. When they do attend church, their meeting houses are simple, their clothes are modest, rarely bright in color, and they take their purpose in life seriously. Their purpose is inner-directed, derived from the divine spark within. They are self-sufficient, independent people with strong convictions, a combination of meekness and modesty, along with drive, who live purposeful lives. They do not honor high position, but purity of heart. Above all, they follow their own conscience and seek peace of mind. Hoover was not a typical Quaker. He had an unusually bright and inventive mind, coupled with ferocious drive and mental and physical toughness. But fundamentally, he remained a Quaker through and through. This was the source of his philanthropies, some conducted anonymously, and to his commitment to public service, as well as his lack of ostentation. What mattered was not simply what you did, but why you did it. That is one reason he believed charity started at home, along with frugality and a sound education. Government aid should be available, but as a last resort, rather than a first resort. Because it lacked a heart, government solutions were impermanent, perfunctory, and represented the easy way out. He favored private charity not simply because it aided the indigent, but because it ennobled the giver. Hoover's philosophy was more personal than political, and it does not fit a niche. He borrowed some attributes from classical liberalism, practical idealism, moderate conservatism, and the progressive movement. But he was more and less than all of these. If he was a conservative at all, he was an unconventional one. He thought out of the box. Hoover was no lover of bigness, whether big government, big business, big fortunes, or a big military establishment. His record shows that he preferred to streamline and decentralize government, break up monopoly, regulate monopoly in the limited areas in which it served an essential purpose, and disperse large fortunes via high inheritance and estate taxes. These views are also implicit in his relatively modest lifestyle. His belief that flaunting wealth was in bad taste, and in his giving away of much of his own fortune. Hoover believed that not only democracy, but capitalism and virtually any kind of human endeavor requires leadership that must spring from the grassroots. He thought the family was the cornerstone of democracy, along with an educated citizenry, preferably in free public schools. He preferred small towns, especially farming communities, to the cities in which he spent much of his adult life. He found peace of mind in the outdoors, especially in fishing and in nature. He felt that strong bodies complemented strong minds. He believed in individuality, in self-discipline, that the only kind of morality that really counts is when no one is looking. He believed in self-help, in helping neighbors. If government help was essential, it should begin at the local level, ascend to the state level, and should be undertaken at the national level only when lower institutions closer to the people were unable to accomplish the job. At the same time, he was an activist. He was never a passive personality. He believed in aggressive government when the situation demanded it. Yet, the bureaucracy created to solve temporary problems should be temporary, not the closest thing on earth to eternal life. He detested bureaucracy in all its forms. Bureaucracies inherently were inefficient, inflexible, and self-perpetuating. If there was a need for something, he wanted it to be handled in the simplest, most humane way possible. He believed bureaucracies lacked the human touch and were wasteful, skimming off a great deal of their assets in overhead and tainted by nepotism and political favoritism. Hoover was unusually consistent in his beliefs. His foreign policy was integrated not only with his domestic policy, but in his Quaker roots that eschewed force in nearly all cases, but stopped short of absolute pacifism. He supported the League of Nations and diplomatic involvement on a broad variety of fronts, but did not believe America should become a world policeman. Prior to the Depression, he planned to make preservation of world peace his greatest priority as president. His first act after his election in 1928 was a goodwill tour of Latin America, during which he used the term good neighbor policy, often attributed to Roosevelt, which meant non-interference. He believed in protective tariffs, but considered the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 excessively high and signed it reluctantly only after Congress agreed to include a tariff commission that would permit him to lower tariffs without returning to Congress for another round of log rolling. By the 1970s, with faith in big government dissipating in the wake of the war on poverty, high taxes, mounting debt, and fear that government had grown too large, too impersonal, and too inefficient, historians on the right and the left began to find redeeming qualities in Hoover. He had, after all, predicted many of the evils critics now found in American society. Some New Left historians joined moderates in resurrecting Hoover from the ash heap of history. The fact that Hoover was both a reformer and a conservative seemed to some an oxymoron. Yet Hoover believed that most social and economic problems had to be solved gradually, with restraint. Hoover had always believed in the Quaker philosophy of equality of opportunity, but that did not extend to manufacturing equality of outcome, which he considered a practical impossibility. He doubtless would have opposed both affirmative action and the concept of entitlements. He believed that the government should serve all the people rather than cater to interest groups. Further, he shared the conservative view of uplifting all by a consistently growing economy rather than slicing the economic pie differently in a static economy. As long as human imagination prevailed, there would be new frontiers of opportunity and experience. The Hoover rebirth was stillborn with the flush times of the latter 1980s and the renaissance of conservatism under a more charismatic hero, Ronald Reagan, who won plaudits for his tough yet nuanced Cold War diplomacy and his determination to defeat communism with the dollar. Reagan drove home the theme that the government had become its own and the people's worst enemy. If Hoover had possessed Reagan's oratorical ability, and Reagan had possessed Hoover's brilliant mind, there might have been the making of a super president. Someday, through genetic engineering, perhaps. To evaluate Hoover in historical context, we must compare him with his predecessors, not solely to his successors, especially to his immediate successor. All too often, Hoover is used as a foil for Roosevelt, or a straw man to enhance Roosevelt's reputation, which is unnecessary. Hoover mitigated the Depression, but did not end it. His administration was not a total failure, but rather an incomplete success, if ending the Depression is a criterion for success. By that standard, the New Deal, too, was an incomplete success. It has been said of Hoover that he is a political orphan, too progressive for the conservatives and too radical, and too progressive for the conservatives and too conservative for the radicals. Before the Depression sucked the life out of his plans to utilize social science to reform every nook and cranny of American life, Hoover had entered office with exceptionally high expectations, a warning to any president who enters office under such expectations. Hoover was, in fact, neither a free market purist nor a reckless experimenter. He wanted his experiments to have a relatively high chance of succeeding. There were limits to his progressivism and to the degree with which he was willing to have the government intervene in the economy and in the lives of Americans. He intended to carefully define and delineate the role of government and, when possible, to rely on cooperation rather than compulsion. However, those who criticize Hoover for relying too heavily on voluntarism tend to forget that FDR's most sweeping program for economic reform and recovery, the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, had no teeth and required solely on voluntary compliance. Moreover, the Supreme Court, during Hoover's tenure and much of Roosevelt's, almost certainly would have nullified a more coercive approach. Hoover accepted a social safety net within limits. He did not believe either the rich or the poor were inherently predatory and resisted demonizing them. He believed individuals had a right to the fruits of their labors, which were inherently unequal. The purpose of government, he thought, should be to strengthen and support free enterprise, not to compete with it. During the 1920s and 1930s, Hoover strove to implement his philosophy of government in order to encourage and stimulate both capital and labor without renting the fabric of democracy. He disliked the types of solutions that involved partisanship by pitting one group against another. His underlying purpose was to preserve American traditions that had served the nation well, especially equality of opportunity, while updating them and adapting them to a modern technological society. Education played a key role. Thus, he wanted to integrate the old with the new, to evenly pace progress and not dash around like the Mad Hatter, nor tarry at the pace of the tortoise. He searched for ways to solve problems such as Social Security and provide greater security for employment, as well as adjusting production to consumption and providing a greater distribution of wealth long before they were seriously attempted, much less accomplished. But his method was to lead, not to browbeat, and to employ existing institutions. wherever possible. He did not resist change, but neither did he believe in change for the sake of change. Hoover was not a great president because there is no singular accomplishment one can point to that would place him in the triage of great presidents. Nor was he an astute politician, because that was not a major priority for him. But taken over the course of his life, Hoover was a great man. Perhaps no man was more devoted to the service of his nation, both before and after his years in the White House, than Hoover. Jimmy Carter is an ex-president, perhaps, but Carter's presidency was not bookended by such outstanding achievements. One of the overlooked aspects of Hoover's contribution were the books he wrote. A great deal of very important books. Style did not come easily to him. Yet good writing consists of more than simply good style. Content is even more important. And in this respect, Hoover's books stand the test of time. Few have left so thorough and unpretentious an account of his life and his epoch, and it would be virtually impossible to reconstruct it without these words, some of which it must have been very painful to write. Hoover was writing until nearly the day he died, in longhand, no less. He had learned one of the great lessons of life: never quit. Sometimes Hoover swam against the tides of history, but he never drifted. He never gave up. Hoover always followed his conscience and never took the easy way out, never dodged challenges. Many of his Cassandra-like warnings about the addictive nature of overspending and reliance on large government with its ever-growing bureaucracy seem prophetic. In many respects, he was not behind his times, but ahead of them. Sometimes Hoover, like Woodrow Wilson, a man he admired, was right in principle, but wrong in degree. He predicted that communism would implode, and was wrong only in the timing. He predicted bureaucracy would explode, and was right in the timing, but probably underestimated the degree. He had great faith in the people, even though voters are fickle. And he knew that democracy only was a method, not a magic. He knew that it only means that more than 50% of the people are right more than 50% of the time. Neither did he ever lose faith in himself and what he had done and what he had tried to do. Hoover's personality is probably as little understood as his presidency. He had a better sense of humor than most people realize, partly because it was too subtle for the masses. Few people know of the depth of his love for children, or how well read he was, especially in history. He knew the past, and he also knew that children were the future. Hoover was that rare man who answers in the affirmative whether a great man can be a good man. He was kind and gentle, as well as tough and smart. He got mad, but he got over it, and never exploded in public. His administration ended without a single serious scandal on its record. Not only did Hoover believe that ghostwritten speeches were intellectually dishonest, but his wife, Lou, wrote her own speeches too. Perhaps Hoover was honest to a fault. I doubt our present political system is capable of producing such a man again. His integrity and other traits can be attributed partly to his Quaker rearing, partly to the struggle of making it on his own as an orphan, and partly to growing up on the cusp of the frontier. Yet West Branch has produced many Quakers, other orphans, and those of Hoover's time all grew up on the cusp of the frontier. Yet West Branch has produced only one, Herbert Hoover. Part of what made him who he was simply inside of him. He had gifts, and he made the most of his life. He never cheated his maker. In fact, he never cheated anyone.